going to do is figure out, after we've won this freedom from the Revolutionary War, we got to set up our nation, which doesn't happen. So the first subtopic is the inauguration of the nation's first president. We're going to just kind of talk about that and talk about our first presidential cabinet and things that have to be done now that we have gotten this independence. Remember, a lot of Southern loyalists were kind of worried about watch what you wish for because you might get it. You know, now they have to go through the stability of setting up a government, setting up a tax system, doing all these things that Britain provided for us prior. And that's kind of why these Southern loyalists were wondering why we were wanting our independence so bad. Does that make sense? Well, now we're going to have to do this. So we'll go from there. Now, on April 30th of 1789, April 30th of 1789, a crowd gathered at Wall Street in New York City. Ever heard of Wall Street in New York City? Because they were going to inaugurate the first president of the United States there. Because what's not the nation's capital yet? Washington, D.C. So on April 30th, 1789, a crowd gathered at Wall Street in New York City for the inauguration of our first president, which is going to be George Washington. Now, I want you to put yourself in George Washington's mind as he's taking the oath of office, and what questions might you be asking yourself as they're swearing you in as the nation's first president? Keller, what would you be thinking? Well, that's a good overall question. You might be thinking, how am I going to transform these 13 separate states now, not colonies, right, into one federal government? Because what do each of these states have? Their own government. So that might be one thing Washington had going through his mind. How am I going to transform these 13 separate governments, basically, state governments, into one federal government? And then once I did that, what do you think the chances are that this government that I'm going to put together is going to succeed? And once we establish it, how long will it really last? This guy's starting from scratch, right? So he's got to transform 13 separate entities into one federal government, okay? And there's going to be a lot of things along the line. Now, who else is going to have to help Washington do this? Who else? Members of? What do you say? Parks may say Parliament? Yeah, the American Parliament is called what though? Congress. Very good, very good. So, it would be the responsibility of not only George Washington, but the newly elected Congress to establish this new nation. Now, before we get too far, I want to explain what Congress is. Congress is two different branches. You have the House of Representatives, right? And the Senate. There's a huge difference. Now, I'm talking in present day. Right now, it's probably more prestigious today to be a senator than a member of the House. Which one has a longer term? Anybody know what the term of a senator is in America's government today? How many years? Say it. 6. How about a member of the House? 2. So, when somebody says, if you hear about a political person, and they, like John F. Kennedy served in both houses of Congress, what would that mean? If he served in both houses of Congress? Senate and House. Normally, which one comes first? Normally, you're a representative, then you get yourself into the Senate seat. That's how it works. Well, Congress was the same here. You had senators and representatives. Now, here's how it worked at the time. At the time of this new government, there were 26 senators. Tell you that there are 2 from each state. Okay? So Washington has 26 senators. 2 from each state. And then he had 59 representatives, basically from various states. There was no real semblance of order on that. So he had 26 senators, 2 from each state, and then 59 representatives that came from various states. So when we talk about the inauguration of the nation's first president, he was inaugurated in New York City on Wall Street on April 30th, 1789. His biggest question he asked himself is, how am I going to transform 13 separate governments into one federal government? And it's going to be his responsibility in the newly elected Congress, which consisted of 26 senators and 59 representatives. Yeah.
So if he didn't run against it, they just kind of chose him.
Yeah, there's some controversy on that. They're actually, Washington wasn't the first president, but it wasn't election-like. It's a good point. Well, he wasn't elected like you do now. We'll talk about that. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is basic problems of organizing a new federal government. These are the problems that Washington and the Congress are going to have to overcome to establish a new government, because we have no government. Basic problems of organizing a new federal government. Now I got 9 here that I'm going to give you. And I'm going to kind of start out and then we'll ask you to see if you know some of the others. Number 1 is they had no federal laws. That was a basic problem when you organize the federal government. There's no federal laws. What all type of laws are there? State, individual state, which may be different. Okay? That doesn't work very good. There were no federal laws. Also, there were no law enforcement officers to enforce any federal laws. So there's no federal laws, number 1. Number 2, there's no law enforcement officers. Now, once a person breaks the law and gets arrested, where do they go to? Before that, court. There was no court systems. So we got no federal laws, number 1. We got no law enforcement officers, number 2. We got no court systems to make any decisions on who's innocent or guilty, number 3. What else are we incredibly short of? What? Money. That's number 4. There was very little money in the country because 5, we owed a large debt from what? The Revolutionary War. So there's no laws, number 1. There's no law enforcement officers, number 2. There's no court systems, number 3. There's very little money in the country, number 4. And number 5, the nation owed a large debt from the Revolutionary War. How do you pay your debts? What? Well, good. Number 6, no method of collecting taxes. No methods of You guys didn't get any dumber over Christmas. You got smarter. 16 days didn't hurt any of you. There's no method of collecting taxes to raise revenue. Well, let's say you did have a way to raise taxes, to collect taxes to raise revenue. There was no federal treasury to put it in. That would be number 7. So number 6, there's no method in place for collecting taxes to raise revenue because of the large debt you owe from the Revolutionary War. And number 7, there's no federal treasury to put the money in. Another huge problem we had is we had a very weak what? What?
Army.
Very good. Military. And when you have a very weak military, after you gain your independence, what are you susceptible to? Attacked by other foreign countries. You say, oh, they might have gotten rid of England's rule, but they're pretty weak right now. We'll go over and get after them. So the nation, number 8, had a very weak military after the Revolutionary War, made us very vulnerable from other foreign countries. And number 9, the nation had no foreign policy. What's foreign policy there, Hannah, my dear? That's very good. You have to have foreign policy, how you're going to relate with foreign countries. Domestic is home, foreign is away. Domestic policy, you might hear this on the presidential debates. Domestic policy is policies at home, foreign policy is on outside the country. So those were 9 basic problems that George Washington and the Congress had to organize a federal government. Which takes us to the next subtopic, which is Congress goes to work. Now, are they going to solve all these problems immediately? No. But they're going to take care of some right away. And the first one they take care of ends up being called the Judiciary Act of 1789. So one of the first and most important measures that Congress adopted in our country's history was the Judiciary Act of 1789. One of the first and most important measures that Congress adapted, or laws they established, was called the Judiciary Act of 1789, which did the following 4 things. What do you think it did? Anybody want to guess the big one? Go ahead. Go
Did
ahead.
we have the judicial branch yet, or was that not formed yet?
States had versions of it. Remember we talked about that, but not overall.
Okay.
Okay, what it did, number 1, is it established what in America? The federal court system. Established the federal court system in America. Established the federal court system in America. Second thing it did is it established a Supreme Court. And our first Supreme Court had 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. So it established a Supreme Court with 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. So that's the big one, right? We got a Supreme Court. Well, in order for the Supreme Court to hear anything, there's got to be a lower court, doesn't there? Okay? So it established 3 circuit courts. So, number 1, a federal court system in America was established. Number 2, a Supreme Court with 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. 3 circuit courts. And where were they placed, do you think? There's 3 of them. They had to put them where, do you think? What? Where they put these 3 circuit courts? Well, not specifically.
Around.
3 different locations spread out among the colonies, okay? So 3 circuit courts were established, spread out among the colonies. Now they got to have some sort of a court to appeal to the circuit court, which would then appeal to the Supreme Court. What do you think these were called? District courts, 13 of them, 1 in each state. They're states now, okay? So the Judiciary Act, number 1, created the federal court system in America. Number 2, established a Supreme Court with 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. Established 3 circuit courts that were spread evenly across the colonies. And 13 district courts, 1 in each state. So, if you had an issue and it went to district court and you didn't like the decision, Carly, where could you appeal to? If you had a decision in a district court that you didn't like, where would you appeal to, dear? And then, Carly, if your decision at the circuit court, you didn't like that, where would you appeal? And once the Supreme Court made the decision, that was it, final. It's kind of like the chain of command. If a student doesn't like the way things are done in my class, then they come and complain to me. If I don't give them the decision they make, then they go complain to Mr. Smith. If Mr. Smith doesn't give them the decision they like, they go complain to Mr. Nicholas. If it doesn't go to Mr. Nicholas, and he doesn't like his answer, he goes to the board. Normally when the board makes the decision, it's final. They're kind of the Supreme Court of the district. Well, this is what the Judiciary Act of 1789 did. Now, we have to have a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Anybody want to guess who the first one was in our country's history? Somebody must have done a report on this person. Davy Crockett would not be the guy, but thank you. Did anybody do a report on John Jay? Naya Beth, what's the deal? John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Have we not talked about him before?
He was one of the...
Who was?
Yeah, the son.
Yeah,
Okay. Now, you got to remember, because of the Judiciary Act, the Supreme Court, as I mentioned, had all power over what? Individual districts and individual states. Okay? So the Supreme Court has power over all individual states. Because what are we trying to develop here overall? A federal government or nation. Now, you know, this didn't go over real good at first. Because at this time in American history, people believed themselves as citizens of individual states, not a federal system. Okay? You hear about this today. You can smoke marijuana freely at a certain age in Colorado, but you can't do it here. Okay? We've got states' rights in some of these. This issue of states' rights that they're complaining about a little bit right now is going to be a key factor in what? Down the line, in which thousands of people are killed. Civil War. We'll talk about that. So there were people who thought, I'm not really the citizen of a federal government or federal nation. I'm a citizen of Georgia. I'm a citizen of Massachusetts. And there we go. Now because of this, the Supreme Court had to abolish what? What did the Supreme Court have to be the bad guy and do? Tell each of the 13 states that what? Your laws do not apply. You cannot have an independent government. You are now part of the federal government. So the Supreme Court was the body that stepped in and told individual states, guess what? We're forming a federal government, and you cannot have an independent government of your own. And what are they following now that we have established that we haven't talked about? What do these states have to follow? The United States Constitution. Now, I'm not going to get into the Constitution too much because I'm going to leave that for your government teacher. Okay? But the United States, after doing the Declaration of Independence, and once they got their independence, we formed the United States Constitution. And what was one of the most important laws in the Constitution? The Bill of Rights. Okay? Anybody know how many amendments there are in the Bill of Rights? 27. Very good. Presently. Presently. Now, the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights were passed on September 25th, 1789. The first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights were passed on September 25th, 1789. Now, once they're passed, who has to ratify them or make them official? Congress. So the first 10 were passed on September 25th, 1789, but they were ratified by Congress on December 15th, 1791. So the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights were passed on September 25th, 1789, and were ratified by Congress on December 15th, 1791. And as Will quite astutely said, he didn't get done over the Christmas vacation by far. There are 27 amendments to the Bill of Rights right now. Okay? Now, is the Bill of Rights and the Constitution under scrutiny a little bit today, right now, today? Why? What? Well, kind of, but what's the big hot issue right now? Guns. Arms. Right to bear arms. Okay? And they're having some issues with this because of these shootings. And of course, the gun advocates say, you know, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Those types of things. So it's a big deal right now. President Obama is supposedly going to use an executive order, bypass Congress, to try to pass some more strict registration laws on guns. Okay? So it depends on where you live. My wife says, you better, you know, you've got all those guns and that stuff, you know, they're going to come and take all this away. I says, let them try. I got just about enough ammunition downstairs to hold them off for a week. Okay? Guns, I don't want to get, you know, I saw a Facebook thread over Christmas with one of our former students, who I really like, but man, this guy is on an absolute other end of the spectrum kick on this. It's an interesting thing. But the Constitution is very important, kids, and the Bill of Rights, because we even talk about them today. Okay? All right, let's move on to creating a presidential cabinet. So now that we've established through the Supreme Court that these states cannot act independently, now we have to figure out how we're going to get this going, and we're going to talk about the president's first cabinet. And we'll talk about presidential cabinets a lot in the next year and a half. Now, after President Washington was inaugurated, Congress established 3 executive departments to help Washington with his work. Congress created 3 executive departments to help the president with his work. This is early. 3 executive departments. What's executive mean? Has to do with what in government. Executive is the highest level, presidential level. Okay? The first department that was established was the Department of State. Department of State. And the reason that they put together the Department of State was to help the president handle foreign and domestic affairs. Foreign affairs being over outside the country, and domestic affairs being inside the country. So the Department of State was established to help the President of the United States handle both foreign and domestic affairs. The second department that was established by Congress after Washington's inauguration was the Department of the Treasury. Department of the Treasury. And this was established to help the President of the United States with financial issues within the nation. Department of the Treasury. Financial issues. And the third department, we have more than this now, but this is what we had at the time, was not the Department of Defense as you know as of today, but it was called the Department of